but also the importance of dying with dignity. You know, I was a nurse and I always thought dying with dignity was overrated. When you die, you die. But actually, Richard's death was the most beautiful part of his illness. You know that thing where you've been on this journey and I'm exhausted and I'm sitting in a dim lit room with Richard's hypnotic breathing. I thought, I'm going to fall asleep. I won't be here for him. I'll fall asleep. So I was really fighting it and I wouldn't go to the toilet. I just kept thinking with horror that we've been through all of this and he might slip away while I've just nipped to the loo or I've just suddenly fallen asleep in the chair next to him. And a lovely nurse called Tracy, I saw her when we were filming and I hope she's still there. She's amazing. She came in and she said, do you want me to sit with you? And she held Richard's other hand and I held the other one. And she chatted to me about where I met him and early life in nursing. So I just think it was lovely that against the backdrop of us murmuring and sometimes laughing quietly, he slipped away. There was a kernel of, I'm definitely leaving him. But we had all these drama moments where he would throw my clothes out the window. He would say, I'm going to slash my wrists. I'm going to kill myself. You can't leave me. Everything was just too difficult. Then I was thinking, where am I going to live? I have no money in my account. He has all the money. I had all the debt.
And that was the first clue that your parents had that was going on. You'd managed to keep it from them.
I never told anybody. Not one person.
Goodness me.
So because of that, I knew I had to leave him. It was great. I just think if we asked women, how did you leave, more than we asked them, why did you stay, we might actually learn something.
But we hear so much about women that leave and it takes them, I don't know how many goes or how many attempts at leaving and going back until they finally can really break away. But it can be so very difficult if they're financially dependent, if there's children involved. Like there's so many reasons why they should stay.
Yeah. So I definitely made a conscious decision to choose life. And if you choose life, it spawns 100 other decisions. You know, you choose relationships, you choose learning, you choose movement, you choose loving, failing, success. You choose everything that being a vital human being brings you. And so many people in my life as they age forget that that's what they should be doing. They don't live vitally. In fact, what they do is they kind of live in the past, or they're in stasis, they're dawdling. They're not living with their eyes wide open. Where are you going on holiday? Oh, I'm going to that place in Spain we always go. So you know where you're going just before you go. And when you land, you know exactly what you're doing. Like your brain hates that. You know, you say, Thursday night, I always go to the Indian. Yeah, I never go anywhere else. No. And Sundays, roast beef. Would you ever have chicken? Oh, God, no, we've always had roast beef on a Sunday. So if people are subconsciously going through their life, not living it fully, that's okay. But I'm always here to remind them that you have a choice.
Norah, it's an absolute pleasure to have you here today.
Thanks for having me.
So you're just back from the Cannes Film Festival, actually, aren't you?
Yeah, that sounds so glamorous.
It does, doesn't it? Let's go straight in there with the glamour puss.
There was a certain glam element to it, as in, you know, Tom Hanks and Robert De Niro and everything. I went to 2 or 3 of the premieres, so I saw all the action. But the other side of Cannes that people don't know is that those of us in the film industry kind of meet and we have conferences and breakfast sessions and, you know, you're on the go from 7 in the morning till 7, 8, 9, 10 at night, constantly learning. And I went there with the specific aim of learning about virtual production, which is a new digitalized format where, you know, I think for the first time the film industry can be more sustainable. So we don't have to go out and blow up cars and blow up buildings and put people at risk. We can do it in an LED studio. And also it makes it more family friendly because increasingly the talk of Cannes is you can't get cast or crew. So now people don't want to spend, fathers and mothers, 6 months on location in Namibia when they've got young children. So it means that we can put them into a studio and create the backdrop and allow them to work almost a 9-to-5 job, you know.
I never thought of that actually about actors and being away from their families. I just thought everyone just I just thought it was part of the job. So I can understand though why it would be.
Yeah, I think I was in Davos in January and my aim there was to learn as much as possible about AI and of course got a chance to meet ChatGPT, but also I have a mental health app that's AI. I embraced it in a way because I was so scared of it. You know, so, and especially the threat it does to my industry and media. And I went to Cannes specifically to do all the Cannes Next programs, which is really all about the future for the film industry. And for the first time, I think I felt it democratizes the film industry. At the moment, only the big bucks people can make films, and they're very boring. They're all sequels and prequels, and original idea is, there's a dearth of original idea out there. And the second powerful people in that little tree of film is the distributor. So increasingly, big players like Netflix and Amazon are dictating what we watch, and the creators are bottom of the ladder. They're nowhere to be seen. So by bringing in virtual production, it totally makes filmmaking and documentary making accessible to the creators, so that they can afford to produce things that are of a high quality and they can stream. So it'll revolutionise film. It's very early days, though.
Yeah,
I'm working in that space now. I hope for the future. So I'm partnering with people in London to kind of do. I'm all humanitarian. All my documentaries are humanitarian and social disadvantage, and working in parts of the world that you really could benefit from some virtual production.
Yeah.
For instance, when I do domestic violence, it's very rare that women can talk to camera without being pixelated or the voice is modulated. And then naturally the distribution channels don't want to show that, because the emotional disconnect of looking at a pixelated face is a really difficult thing for them. If you can't see the woman, how she's talking, her expressions, how she sounds, then it's very hard for people to understand what she's been through. So for me, in the last few years, I just keep thinking, why is it there's an entire group of women silenced because of the legal issues, because of family issues? And in this era where we have robots and AI and virtual production, there has to be a better way to do this. So I think I've found a good way to do it.
Okay.
After a fair few documentaries, but watch this space. I'm hoping
I'm intrigued
I have,
by that.
yeah.
And is that like almost having like an AI actor and being able to use the expressions that a woman might use?
Maybe, but I think I could use humans actually, so I won't say too much because I think it's a very clever idea, and I'm kind of
No problem.
hoping that I can do it, but until I can sit around the table with all of the producers and everything.
And how did you get into film then? Because you were originally print. I suppose, is it a natural...
Well, in my 20s, I transitioned from a nurse to a journalist, and I did the postgrad journalism programme for 2 years in Harlow. And then I did film, TV production and direction at Ealing College for 2 years at night. And I did radio at the BBC. So in my 20s, I was hosting on BBC and I was working on Sky. I had my own show on LBC and I was earning my living in print, that's for sure. So it was a natural progression for me to go back into TV after Richard died, my husband died. I had been working in and around things like Dragon's Den and other business type programming, but I went back first of all to co-anchor News Talk Breakfast. Ivan Yates had gone to Wales, so I did a 4 a.m. start for the guts of a year and quite a bit. So if I said to you, get up at 4 a.m. every morning next week, you'd probably find it difficult. And I did that for a very long period of my life after he died. But it suited me and Dara. We broadcast from 7 till 10, all current affairs and politics, which is naturally where I'm aligned to. But I also took on the afternoon show in Cork with Blonde and Coffee. We hosted a kind of a more of a, I suppose, loose women style show with a live audience on Friday in Cork. And I literally left News Talk in the back of my own car, which an out of work taxi driver drove. And I had a duvet and a pillow to sleep because by then those 4 a.m. starts like stay on top of you. And I also did 13 episodes of a program called The Takeover, where I went into businesses and kicked out the bosses and let the staff loose on the place. So I do remember Oliver Callan walking into a gig once about 2 years into that, and Oliver Callan spotted me and he said, "Wow, there's loads of jobs in Ireland, folks. It's just Norah Casey has them all, you know." And it is true. I was busy.
You've quite a busy CV, don't you then?
I found busyness, I think at the two difficult periods in my life, I embraced work in a way that exhausts me thinking about. So there was no second to actually have to think about the catastrophe. And it also gave me great energy. Just, I'd say before I went back into News Talk, I had months of walking in the forest with Dara, and me and my brain were not good company. And then Vincent Brown was hosting his Virgin Media, TV3 as it was then, show, and he went on holiday and they asked me to stand in. And I said yes. I mean, like a pure, I don't know, Egypt. As my father's, what class on Egypt are you at all? Like, I was months not even able to talk to anyone. If you asked me how I was, you'd get a monosyllable. And here I was hosting this big, heavy political and current affairs program. I remember pulling up in front of TV3 and, sort of saying to myself, what the hell are you doing? And I went in and met the producer, who I still know to this day. He said, are you all right? I said, sure, yeah. I went to the toilet. I threw up. And the whole afternoon there was briefs coming in. It was around the time of the fiscal treaty, I think. So it was a very heavyweight European financially dominated program. And it was like reading Ulysses, reading those briefs. I mean, I kept reading it and it slither out of my mind. And she'd come in and say, how are you doing? And I'd dump a few pages off the top of the pile to pretend I'd read them. But I was really, I don't think I've ever been more scared. And then you're sitting in the studio with all of these people. I think Pascal O'Donoghue was there. There was a lot of heavy hitters on the show. And I had a rash in my neck going down to my chest. I had a lump in my throat. I couldn't see the autocue, because my head was buzzing so much. But you know what? When the show started, I just got into it. And
it was like something in your brain
clicked. Yeah, it's because I did it before, and I'm naturally interested in those areas. So the hour flew by before I knew it. They were saying, okay, it's 30 seconds to close, and the music was playing. And then on the way home, it's based in Ballymount, and I always phoned my mum, on the way back from there, and I wouldn't shut up. I mean, I talked the whole journey. She said, what's happened to you? Like, you couldn't say a sentence yesterday. And did you hear what he said? And then I asked the question. So I kind of realised something really important, that when your personal life is not great and you've gone through something that really derailed me, that I could actually get energy and creativity from work.
Yeah.
So I just said, that's where I need to be for the next few years.
It's almost like you can switch off and just focus on the work and forget about, all the stuff that's going on. Yeah. And what was the catastrophe that had precipitated this,
I guess,
monosyllabic Norah?
So Richard had got sick at 48, which was very sudden. We'd been away actually for 6 months, and the business was going through some really big times. We were getting licenses from Asia and Australia. My sister had died a few months before Richard got sick. And it was really quite brutal. It was from diagnosis to death, about 4 months. He was fit and healthy, and we'd actually been out with Mags Nelson, who runs FM 104, and her husband, and he was complaining of a pain in his back the next day, and I was ribbing him, saying that you drank too much wine, and then he peed bright blood and ended up in hospital. And in the first week they said they couldn't find anything wrong. They thought it was kidney stones, and then in the second week they found a tumour in the wet lining of his bladder, and they thought they were just going to take the kidney out and he would be fine and do chemo. But I had moved him over to somebody in James's that we both knew very well, a urologist, and he did PET scans and discovered 3 in his liver and 2 in his spine. Now, we're only 2 weeks into it at this point, and they're not talking about operations anymore. And then they did radiotherapy at Luke's to stabilise the spinal tumours because they were quite close to his spinal cord. But unfortunately, when they radiated them, they split his spinal cord. So they were going to operate at the matter on his spinal cord, and then they decided there was too much cancer. So he was in a wheelchair within 3 weeks. And never got a break. I'd say all the times we were in James's, we were constantly waiting to see, could he have chemo? He had a very toxic 3 chemo types, I guess, and on.
Yeah.
So he didn't tolerate it too well, and just all the time his cancer kept progressing. And his oncologist kept saying, I have people who go on holiday and have no chemo and their cancer won't progress. You're having active chemo. And we're finding more and more. And before long, they found some in his lungs and more in his liver and in his ribs. And they said, that's it, don't think, you just need to get your affairs in order. So it was very brutal on both me and Dara. Dara had lost his best friend at 9 to cancer. And he felt all along that his dad was going the same way. And I kept reassuring him that he wasn't, because I didn't believe that. Yeah. In the early days when we were talking about it, I said that, no, he's nothing like Thomas. Everything's going to be different. But in fact, it was exactly like that. And he went into the hospice just to get his pain under control. There's a great guy there called Paul Gregan. Do you know him? Palliative guy. He's wonderful. And we were by then under John Crown. We'd moved over. John Crown thought that he might be able to buy some extra time with a different type of chemo. And his pain was really bad because it was in his bones, and it's quite hard to control that. So he said, look, nobody here is a specialist in palliative care. You should go into Paul Gregan. He's wonderful, and he is wonderful. And we went to visit him first, and then Richard agreed to go in for a week to be assessed, and he was going to look at all his drugs and change them. But a few days after he was in there, he developed pneumonia, and he died really quickly. I'd say 5 days later he was dead. And it was really difficult because we had, until that moment, never talked about his death. And him and Dara had never spoken honestly about his death. And then it was coming, Rich was getting sicker and sicker, and they couldn't get an IV line in to do his antibiotics. So I think we both knew that night that once he said, it's okay, leave it till tomorrow, that it probably wasn't going to go back in,
Yeah.
And then Paul Gregan said, I need to talk to you both. And Richard has decided he doesn't want to be part of the conversation. So I'll bring you into the room, the visitor's room. And he drew a picture of Richard's body and, just an outline, and marked an X where the cancer was. He could be hard pressed to find anywhere that there wasn't cancer.
Okay.
And he said, Dara, do you want to ask me any questions? And Dara said, yes, I do. Is my dad dying? Now, I nearly died when he asked that, because that's not a question I would have been brave enough to ask myself.
How old was your son at the time?
He was 12.
Okay.
And Paul Gregan didn't miss a beat. He said, yes, he is, Dara. And Dara followed it with, when is he going to die? And he said, tomorrow or the next day. And that's how I found out Richard was going to die. And that's how Richard found out, because Paul said, I have to go back in and talk to Richard because I've had that conversation with you. And he told me afterwards that when he walked in, Richard said, did Dara ask the hard question? And he said he did. And he said, so what was the answer? And he said, tomorrow, the next day. So we had this honest time between us, which was a gift. It didn't feel like it at the time. But when we walked back into the room with Richard, he was able to hug Dara and tell him all the things he wanted for him, his expectations of him as a young man, and, his graduation and his marriage and all the things that Richard would miss. But it was a very honest, raw moment, which I think me and Dara talk about all the time. So we might not have had that. He might have slipped in, which he did eventually the following day, into a coma, but we had that really great conversation. And then Richard said, I don't want to talk about it anymore. And I did.
Yeah, I'm in tears, Norah.
Well, I'm usually in tears talking about it. So, but the nice thing about that was, it's a lot of talk about death and people's decisions about dying. And I subsequently did an hour-long programme for RTE on death in the Irish. And I had the privilege of speaking to 6 people who were facing their own death about how they felt, in a way that I didn't get a chance to do with Richard. But also the importance of dying with dignity. Now, I was a nurse and I always thought dying with dignity was overrated. When you die, you die. But actually, Richard's death was the most beautiful part of his illness. And it's a really hard thing to say. But the fact that he was surrounded by all his family and friends came in to say goodbye to him once he slipped into a coma. He'd kind of moved himself away from everybody apart from me and Dara. And then I had promised them that they could come in when he could no longer be conscious. And they all went in and spent 5-6 minutes with him praying. He's a great friend who just had a baby and brought the baby in to meet him. And then we had supper together, all of us. Great chef actually cooked for us, and we took over the whole canteen in the hospice and had dinner together. And then I shooed them off home and I sat with Richard. And that thing where you've been on this journey and I'm exhausted and I'm sitting in a dim lit room with Richard's hypnotic breathing, I thought, I'm going to fall asleep. I won't be here for him. I'll fall asleep. So I was really fighting it, and I wouldn't go to the toilet. I just kept thinking with horror that we've been through all of this and he might slip away while I've just nipped to the loo, or I've just suddenly fallen asleep in the chair next to him. And a lovely nurse called Tracy, I saw her when we were filming, and I hope she's still there. She's amazing. She came in and she said, do you want me to sit with you? And she held Richard's other hand and I held the other one. And she chatted to me about where I met him and early life in nursing. So I just think it was lovely that against the backdrop of us murmuring and sometimes laughing quietly, he slipped away.
Okay.
And I think about that often. Firstly, my sister didn't have a death like that. She died in Blanchardstown to the clatter of knives and forks in the background.
What happened to your sister? Oh,
it was a degenerative disease.
Oh, goodness.
But Richard's death was really beautiful. In the end, that's what you hope always, that, somebody will slip quietly away knowing and comforted by the fact that they're surrounded by people that love them,
Yeah.
And it's been a gift ever since. And that's why I was moved to do the programme. I just felt everyone deserves this. So many people die in general hospitals with people who don't understand how to keep them pain-free. And, the whole debate at the moment about euthanasia is really interesting. But in reality, hospices are in the business of helping people to move on pain-free in a way that's so human. And also allows for that conscious decision-making. When I think about the moment, there was a young doctor, female, who was trying to get a vein into Richard's arm so that he could have his life-saving, wasn't going to save his life for too long, antibiotics to fight the pneumonia. And he was fading a lot, and he was sleeping a lot, and he was not doing great. And as she was fighting away looking for the vein, he looked up at me and he said, "When I get out of here, we're going for a damn fine dinner." And she sort of looked at me saying, "Has he lost his marbles completely?" And I said, "Yeah, I think you probably deserve it." He said, "I do deserve it." And he said, "So where are we going?" I said, "Well, maybe you love Venice, don't you?" "Oh, yeah. Let's go to the Danieli and we'll be on the rooftop of the Danieli." And he proceeded over the course of a half an hour to describe that he would be sipping Bellinis. They'd have to get him ostrich steak because that's his favourite. And I was saying, "I don't think they're going to have ostrich steak." "Well, they better get it for me. Look at everything I've been through for the last few months." All the way through to sipping some fine Middleton whiskey, which he loved. And by now, the doctor can't concentrate on the vein. She's looking at the two of us thinking they're all, crazy. And he turned around to her and said with a smile, "I think you can stop looking for a vein."
Okay.
And I looked at him and he looked at me, and that was the moment he decided he was going.
Yeah.
100%. Because he knew that he couldn't keep fighting for too much longer. He was exhausted, and there was no point in putting that in his arm.
Yeah.
Prolonging life.
I find the debate about euthanasia interesting as well. It's about getting it right, though, isn't it, for
I know.
all parties, because it is such a tricky one to decide on.
Yeah.
Because the last thing we want is for someone to feel that they're a burden on their family and therefore they have to go as a result of that. Isn't that right?
And that's why it's an ethical dilemma.
Yeah.
As in, there was a report out during the week about elder abuse, and we know that people, as they age, tend to feel they're a burden on their families, and there's all kinds of manipulative ways that you can make older people do things if you're so minded. And I think, to be honest, if I was to see a priority list in Ireland, I would put dying with dignity ahead of everything, because there's far too many people who just don't get the level of care that Richard got towards the end of his life.
Yeah.
Don't get that beautiful, how can I describe it? It's everything from when Richard went into the hospice first. Firstly, it's a beautiful place. And then one of the volunteers came in and literally sat with him for an hour asking him what he'd like to have for his lunch. I mean, you're in the hospital, somebody throws something at you because they're all busy and they're focused on other things. It's not end-of-life care. And he couldn't get over this, that, somebody would spend all this time, and they made him tomato soup, which all he ate really when he was sick. And the place just had he'd never had a massage in his life. He was one of those macho men that, I would book in a massage for him down in Menart, and he would conveniently not be available at the last minute. Okay. He's allergic to them. They massaged him almost every day, and he loved it.
They're absolute angels that work in the hospice. Those nurses are unreal, because I would have dealt with a lot of them in the pharmacy with patients that were looked after at home up until they just needed to go in for the hospice care. But they are angels in disguise, that they really are, as a calling.
Exactly.
Isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, I think the honest truth, if I think about my life, these very dark things that have happened have made me who I am. And that's the most important thing about all of our lives. It's not as if, are you going to fall down? Of course you're going to fall down. It's inevitable. Everybody's going to fall down. We're going to have life experiences. It's learning how you can put yourself back together again afterwards. And Dara was a huge part of that, because he'd just turned 13 after Richard died, and he was starting secondary school. And, it was really tough as an only child, and it was tough the way Richard died. And I guess for him, in his very young life, he had his best friend, his aunt, and his dad dying, and he felt everyone was going to die, including me, So it was a really difficult transition for him. And news talk was the right discipline for me, because I did my homework with Dara every night. I said no to every social event or dinner or speaking engagement. If I was running the business, I would have been away from him all the time, and I had no appetite. My brother went in and ran the businesses for me. But it was just right for me. I wanted to stand on my own two shoes, and if the cameraman didn't turn up, it was somebody else's problem. My problem was just me and my brain and broadcasting and filmmaking. And I also realized something. You know, I started life as a nurse, and the one important thing that says is I didn't set out to make money. If you start off wanting to be a nurse, you're firstly paid in job satisfaction. That doesn't always pay the mortgage. And secondly, I wanted to make a difference, even in a small way. And it turned out after 5 years doing nursing, I was in Scotland in Auckland, did my general, then did burns and plastics and coronary care. It wasn't for me for life. And I was always grateful that I was brave enough to switch to journalism through the intervention, actually, of a male boss who, by chance, grabbed me one day and said, "What are you doing with your life?" And
a male boss in the hospital?
No, in the Royal College of Nursing.
Okay.
And it was really just one of those water cooler moments where he says, "Come in and have a coffee with me. What's going on with you? You know, I don't think you can go back to nursing." I was working as an advisor with the Royal College of Nursing. He said, "I think you should do journalism. You're writing for The Guardian. You're out and about doing TV all the time." And I said, "Oh, you're right." And he changed the course of my life. He's still alive. His name is David Rye, and he's in
So you were
Britain.
doing TV programmes while you were teaching, or
while I was working for the Royal College of Nursing. Yeah. So I mean, I think firstly it was kind of a brave thing to do, because I went back down to, as my editor constantly reminded me, the rag on the oily floor or whatever, an oily rag on the floor of the newsroom. So you went back down to being a student again. And at that point I was 23, 24. And like I really was with the 18 and 19 year olds, you know.
Yeah.
I was doing postgrad and they were coming in fresh from school. But I was grateful that, you know, I believe the power of mentorship is something I'm embracing, I'm involved in hugely at the moment. But I always think if one person in my life in a 5-minute conversation could change the course of my life, you have to accept that, you know, the power of mentorship is absolutely incredible when it's done properly, you know. But I think I encompass that hybrid of being a nurse, first and foremost, and somebody who embraced the idea that I could possibly do some change, with the idea that I was also a dragon and that I was an investor and I ran businesses, because really that wasn't really about making millions. It was about making a difference. And all of the documentaries that I've been involved in since the News Talk, Vincent Brown, afternoon show era, I kind of realised I need to say yes to everything, that I could decide what to do. So I filmed with young traveller women for 9 months, and that went out on RTE. That was really a brilliant 9 months for me. I'm still great friends with some of those women. One or two of them never learned to read or write, and it was fantastic to work with them to develop their businesses, you know.
Yeah.
And I started working in other spaces like the death one. Just deciding myself that that's an area that I feel I can add value to, rather than, "Oh yeah, you want me to do what? I'll do that," you know.
Yeah.
So which is totally different for me now, you know.
But it also opens up the conversation that probably people didn't talk about, like the young traveller women.
Yeah.
And it's very interesting as an outsider looking in on that, but it's about getting it right.
Yeah.
You have to be able to get the people's story across in a really sensitive manner, isn't that right? So that involves a bit of skill too. I wouldn't be...
Well, I think it was one of the first, you know, I actually think probably the first programme that had ever tackled those kind of issues, you know. And before that, it was all My Big Fat Gypsy Wedding, and it was sort of adding ridicule and being discriminatory towards people. In the UK, they define themselves as gypsies and obviously travellers in Ireland. So I was in and around that community for a while doing the Traveller Awards and working with the Traveller women. And in fact, it was a young woman from the Traveller community who I sat down next to her and she said, "Here, do you think it's hard for you in business being a woman? You want to try being a Traveller woman, you know, and you can't get finance and, you know, there's all kinds of blocks in the way." So she kind of set that seed in my mind. I was thinking, oh, she's right. Like, I mean, truly right. And I was determined, like, most of that was happening in my house with them, or I was living at their houses. So, you know, I was very close to the community and I built really strong bonds there. But always very hard, you know, to come in from the outside and describe something within a community. And what's lovely for me anyway is to see the television broadcasters getting young travellers and talented media travellers who are experiencing the media to come and talk themselves, because that's really the answer. Mm-hmm. It needs to come from within the community. I'm just grateful that I have such good connections with some of those girls, and they're brilliant, you know.
Yeah, no, it's wonderful. But taking you back to your childhood as well, so I know that you became a nurse and that, but you was it in you from the minute you came out of the womb? Because you helped to raise baby gorillas as well, didn't you, as a child?
Yeah, I would say nursing was the furthest thing from my mind growing up.
Okay.
I mean, I grew up in the Phoenix Park and we live at the North Circular Road Lodge, so my mum's still there. And my dad and my granddad were both rangers, so they lived in that lodge, and Casey's are a long-standing resident of the Phoenix Park. I think Max Casey reminds Michael D very often that she's much older than him. Has been there much longer. So she's 92, rules the roost.
Oh.
And my sister lives there. So the Phoenix Park was just this incredible place. There were 8 of us in that 3-bed house, not doing an Angela Ashes moment at all, but they literally opened the door and we, like feral children, ran all over the place.
8 children or
8 of us with my mum and dad.
Okay,
so 6 of
so
us.
6 kids.
But literally, there isn't an inch of the park that we don't know, that we haven't, we have little fake houses in amongst a clump of trees. And if I pass the weed stand at the duck pond, I'm like, oh yeah, I lived there for a while as a child, like pretending that was my shop. Or, I think I was dragged out of that duck pond about 20 times. Like we were always falling in while we were trying to fish for, little tiny baby fish. And I didn't appreciate, I think, growing up how special it was until I left it. And then suddenly I was thinking, wow, that was incredible that we grew up in this huge park. Like it's the biggest inner city park in Europe. And yet I was in the city. It was like getting away from the city by not leaving the city. And, I went to school in Stony Batter to Stanhope Street. And that was great. The boys went to Brunswick Street. So I always say that to people because they often think people like me were beamed down with silver spoon in mouth and every advantage on the planet. I mean, we just had my dad's wage as an OPW worker. My mother was a nurse as well. She didn't go back until we were grown. She worked in the Carrick Cheshire home with physically able people. And it was a great upbringing. Of course, most of that time I was in Dublin Zoo. My friend's dad was a superintendent and we were in there. My mother will tell everybody, she hardly saw me. I would throw my school bag into the porch and run up to the zoo straight after school, sometimes up there early in the morning, every weekend, every summer holiday. And if you asked me what I was going to be, it would never be a businesswoman. I'd never met a businesswoman in my life, apart from the women who sold the Toblerones outside, the apples and oranges and Toblerones outside the zoo. I'd never met a woman engaged in enterprise or entrepreneurship. They weren't on the TV, they weren't in the paper. You certainly didn't see them in political life, or very rarely. So I would have always said, I'm going to work with animals. And I did end up working with dragons.
Absolutely.
Part of it came true.
It absolutely did. And what was it like? How did you come about raising little gorillas? Did you actually go in and cuddle them and feed them and
yes,
act like
I
their
did.
mommy?
Yeah. So we mainly in my childhood, I was in Pet's Corner, as it was called then, and it's called The Farm or something, Family Farm or something now. And there are 2 wonderful women, Teasy and Maureen, who ran it. And it was like, I don't know what you'd describe it as, but a whole bunch of different kinds of kids from all kinds of different backgrounds who go up and volunteer their services. I was a lifelong committed member of that group. Yeah. Everything from sweeping the grounds to clearing out the wishing well to delicing the pigeons to getting privet leaves at the elephant house for the stick insects. We did it all, and there was a Nubian mountain goat that was drilled into me so much I still remember that's what it was, that we had to milk, and she was very bad-tempered and would kick the hell out of you.
You need to milk her.
To milk her. My brothers, of course.
You wouldn't get that nowadays because there need to be all kinds of insurance, signed off and everything.
We were playing with baby lions in the back garden. We were always around animals.
That
My brothers
magical.
Ran the Pony and Trap, and when anybody listening who remembers that, the Pony and Trap used to go around the green in the upper gardens. And my older brother drove the train, which was a real step up. I mean, that was like driving a Ferrari. And my sisters were working in the shop. I mean, the zoo was our community. It was where I grew up, absolutely 100%. And so naturally, I thought I would definitely work in the zoo. I left school at 16. I was an August baby, and my mother probably kicked me in as quickly as she could, seeing as I was the 4th child. So I left at 16. And
Guilty of that myself. Doing that to one of my kids.
I had to hang around for a year, and during that year, these first 2 baby gorillas, lowland gorillas, came into the zoo, and they were in quarantine for the first few months under infrared lamps and everything, and I fed them bottles, and I thought it was the most magical thing I had ever done. And then, of course, in later life, I look back and think, I am now a lifelong conservationist. I spend a month in Africa every year. There isn't an elephant sanctuary I haven't been to. I seek out ways I can help to preserve animals in their natural habitat. So I was slightly horrified then to think that those 2 baby gorillas were probably ripped from their mother too quickly, and they had a bit of a checkered life. One is dead and one is in Edinburgh Zoo. But at the time, Yes, I thought there was nothing cuter than these beautiful baby gorillas. But then I didn't, as a child, even see the polar bears in this tiny enclosure. They eventually moved them to Munich, I think. I didn't see that the elephant was in a small circle and rocking from side to side, and that the lions were interbred. Now it's one of the foremost conservation zoos, and does a huge amount of work to help preserve breeds and swapping animals and making sure that the gene pool is kept fresh and current. So I'm very proud of everything they've done. And my father never set foot in the zoo. Not once in his life. He was a lifelong animal lover himself, and he would never walk into the zoo. He just disagreed with it, yeah. It's funny, like when you're growing up, you just don't see these things sometimes, you know?
Yeah, I know.
And also the park itself had cows and deer, and, you know, it was a beautiful habitat for nature and gorgeous bird species and beautiful flowers. And so it was just a magical place to grow up, you know?
Yeah. And how did you get on in school, Norah?
In what way? Was I good or bad?
Were you academic? You know, did you enjoy school?
God, I don't think anybody's ever asked me that. So the Stanhope Street's a dash school. You know, it's gets funding for, and I'm back and forth there all the time, and they have a photo of me on the wall.
Do they?
Joan
President Norah.
Oh, yeah. Joan Burton's on the wall as well. She went to that school. But I think an unlikely background probably to the rest of my life, as in, it was still in those days where they didn't like, you know, young girls to do honours maths. My sister was the first to do honours maths, actually. She was in the first class to do it. My parents were absolute committed educationists, not in a way that they helicoptered us, but I think if my father and mother put anything into our minds, it was that education was a privilege. So I'd say in school, we were always down in Parnell Square at the People's College doing a grind in French or maths or Irish. There was a constant sort of, and I mean it 100%, they did not sit over us saying, have you got your homework done?
Yeah.
We did it because we wanted to do it. So educationally, I would say in my lifetime, I've gone back to university many times, but my brother and my sister are both PhDs, both working in academia actually, and I would have gone that way. I did my MPhil PhD at the University of Wales, and I hit a crossroads in my life saying I could easily have gone in that route. And that's really because every single time I want to change myself, like from nursing to journalism, go back to education. I want to work in television, back to education. When I became a boss first at CEO at 30, someone recently asked me to name the worst boss they'd ever met, and I nominated myself. Because it's true. I was working my way up the newsroom floor from news reporter to news editor thinking, God, news reporter is the best job. I get to do all the writing. And then I was news editor. Oh, this is the best job. I get to boss the reporters around and change their writing. And eventually you end up as editor and you think, well, this is just bliss. I mean, I have the entire magazine to myself. I can decide what we're going to do and what we're going to launch. Then you're editorial director and you think, well, this is even better. I can decide what to acquire. I can change this. I can launch a new magazine. Then you become CEO and you just crap at it. Like, I mean, you know how to do all those other things, and somebody puts you in an office and you have no idea how to run this huge, it was a huge company with a big book imprint and conference unit and editorial staff, 16 journals, and the staff almost walked out of me because we had a very difficult guy in design and he was kept phoning in sick and he wasn't doing his work, and I, of course, wanted to be the nice boss and not make difficult decisions. They used to have this phrase they put on the blackboard that said, Nora's indecision is final, because when I had board meetings, I would go around the table saying, and what do you think? And what do you think? And a show of hands now, who thinks we should do that? I would just, like, I just couldn't make a decision. So they all sidled into my office one day and said, if you don't do something about him, like, we're walking out because you're making us do his work. And we know you don't want to be unpopular about making a decision, but in reality, you're actually dismissing us. You're treating us as less than equal. So I took myself to Ashridge Management College for 2 years to study strategic management. And I went back and did advanced strategic management there, actually. So I'm a lifelong alumni of Ashridge. So every time in my life that I felt I need to change, swivel, I need to find a new direction, education has been the key to it.
Okay.
And that started, I think, sitting around our kitchen table.
Doing your homework with your brothers and sisters?
No, with my father was an avid current affairs guy. He read every newspaper. I still remember him, cuttings all sitting on the window ledge of things that might interest each one of us. He would lob a ball into the middle of the table to set us all rowing against each other. And the Casey debates were legendary, and he would sit back with a smirk on his face. You know, he got us talking all the time. He made us interested in current affairs and politics. He educated us all day, every day. My mother was the same, and it was very subliminal. But he did create you know, firstly, I always say I was raised by a feminist, and my mother was great too, because, you know, my father working across the road in the park was ever present in our lives, as was my mother. And he sent me and all four of the girls and the two boys out into the world saying, you just rule the world, you can do anything you want. It's only when you get out into the workplace you realise that's not quite true.
I know, yeah, but it's good to have parents that tell you, that make you believe in yourself, isn't it? And, you know. It's
so important. Like, I would just say that there was nothing wrong with Stanhope Street, but it wasn't a great school. I mean, you can imagine it was run by nuns. It didn't have a huge amount of money. You know, the class sizes were big. So it's unlikely that that kind of school would create people like me. But it did. And I would probably say that that was more to do with my parents and their drive for us educationally.
Yeah.
It meant more than anything, really, education, as in meant more than presents or clothes or new things, you know.
I find that so interesting that you go back every time that you're swiveling to education rather than just, you know, trying to wing it or do it on the job, you know.
Even during COVID, I did behavioural science in an online course because I could see that COVID has been run by behavioural science, and I've always been fascinated by it. So I was like working all the way through COVID myself. But I said, I'm going to learn something new as well. So
that's so interesting. You do a lot of work with domestic violence as well because you have your own lived experience with that.
Yeah, I think I only really talked about that about 4 years ago. And I might have talked about it sooner had Richard not died. I certainly wasn't ready to talk about it until 4 or 5 years ago. When I was transitioning from nursing, I'd moved from Scotland to London and I was still quite young. And I met Peter pretty quickly, and he was 40 and he was very sophisticated, only drove Porsches. Not saying that for any reason except that sometimes it gives you an insight into somebody's character. And I didn't have any experience of a relationship, no experience of long-term relationships. So when he fell in love too quickly and put me on a pedestal and called me a princess, I thought it was really true love, you know. Since I've spoken about it, I've met lots of women, and we're almost talking across each other when we say that, because everybody says, oh my God, that happened to me. Within 3 weeks, he was saying he loved me. Oh my God, yes, he said he couldn't live without me, that I was the princess of his life. So I didn't know that at the time at all. And I don't think it was material goods. You know, about the second date, we were going out and we were having dinner, and I made some silly joke. It was the most ridiculous joke on the planet. I said, the last guy I dated was also called Peter. Sorry, I was a very unsophisticated 22-year-old who just came out of nursing. I think I'd taken 2 flights in my life, and here he was putting me into this beautiful restaurant where there was no prices on the women's menus. I was all at sea. I didn't know what cutlery to use or what I was supposed to be doing. And I'm trying to make small talk. And so he leaned across the table and he kind of grabbed my wrist and he said, is this a joke to you? You know, I'm really serious about this relationship and I can't believe that you just said that. And he was weird and his teeth were clenched and I felt very uncomfortable. So I just removed myself and said, I'm just going to the bathroom. And I remember going into the bathroom saying, you need to get out of here. Like, he's crazy. And like, this is the second date or the third date. And he's suddenly talking like I is his lifelong partner, you know. And I didn't like the feeling of it. So I came back and sat down. And as I sat down, I lifted my napkin and a bracelet fell out. And he said, look, I'm so sorry. I've been under pressure at work and everything's very tense. I shouldn't have said that. That was a terrible thing to say. You must think awful things of me. I bought you that bracelet, obviously, before we came along tonight to show you how much I care about you. And then the moment passed and I thought, oh, of course, that was just a little, you know, it was just a little moment that he can be forgiven for. But I wish always I'd trusted my gut because I had moved into his house very quickly. I was staying with Diggs of a friend in Hammersmith. So, you know, I didn't have any money, you know. Yeah. And so I was kind of on and off sleeping at his place and then moved in completely to his house. About 2 years into the relationship, he wanted to take me around the world. He was an avid fan of California and places I'd only dream about. And he had decided that we'd go on this like 3-week trip, and he had my passport, of course, at this point. And he'd also taken to buying clothes for me and things. And he would only shop in Harrods, nowhere else. He had an account there. And the night before we went out to dinner, everything was packed. I still to this day do not know what I said to him. But as we're driving up the drive, I said something that obviously annoyed him because he slapped his hand on the steering wheel and he kind of screeched to a halt. You know, when you hear the cobblestones like screeching out from the tires, and I was like, oh, what did I say? Anyway, he got out his side of the car and I thought, obviously it's okay. So he opened my side and I went to get out. I thought he was helping me, but he actually just took hold of my head and slammed it on the top of the car. And as I'm sort of trying to recover, stunned, he just casually opened the door and went up to bed, left the door open. And the whole side of my face was on fire, and I can assure you there is such a thing as cauliflower ear. And I went in like dazed and shocked, thinking, oh my God, did that really happen? Like, what on earth? Like, why would he do something like that? And as I'm on the couch, I'm thinking, what did she say to make him do that? Already 2 years in, I'm thinking along the lines of, I did that to myself. I said something. Because up until then, apart from that kind of tightened grip on my arm, if a man talked too much to me at an occasion, or just a look with gritted teeth if I wasn't behaving well, or if I talked too much, he'd never displayed that level of violence, you know. And to my shame, then around 5 a.m, I was thinking, what makeup will I put on to hide the bruises that were all down the side of my face? And the next morning, we went to the airport to Heathrow in silence, everything in silence. We were up in the air about an hour, and he leaned over and put his hand on the side of my face, and he was crying, full-blown tears. And he said, I'm so sorry, I can't believe I did that. You know, you must forgive me. I love you. I just had weeks and weeks of terrible work, intense, and I just, you triggered me, and, you know, I just didn't know what I was doing. It was a blind moment. I'm so ashamed of myself. And so, of course, I did exactly what I did the previous time. I said, oh, anyone who loves me and wants to take me around the world and who tells me constantly all day, every day that they love me would never want to harm me. Now, if I had known then what I know now, that if a man takes his hand to you, he's never going to stop, I might have made a different decision. But I didn't. I went on to marry him. And over the course, we were together 9 years. It's a long time. And I always felt very ashamed of that. You know, I found myself in later life sitting on couches with powerful women who the topic would come up and they'd say, oh, if a man took his hand to me, God, I'd, you know, give him a wallet back, or I'd go straight out the door, or I'd have him in court, or I'd phone the guards. And I was hiding my little guilty secret deep inside me. It helped.
But isn't that easy to say by someone who it hasn't happened to?
Yeah, of course it is. But they do say it, you know.
Because, you know, there's so much more to it than just someone raising their hand to you. And, yeah.
I don't think people understand the complexities where love and control are kind of intertwined. I think before long in our marriage, we would have a honeymoon phase of him showering me with flowers and gifts. My father thought that Peter was the best thing that happened to me. He was a wonderful man because he was always very showy about his presence and his gift giving. And then you'd be the walking the eggshell phase where I just knew something was going to blow, but I didn't know when. And I was always careful about what to say, removing myself from situations. I mean, I was allowed to work. So I worked like a demon. I just described it to you. Like, who in their right mind during the 20s, which is supposed to be all about you and going out and having fun. And here I was doing 15 different courses and working in about 5 different places. But I didn't have friends. I was quite removed from my family. I was in London, and somehow or other he manoeuvred it that I wasn't next to family, that I was always with his friends, you know. And then he would blow. And I won't talk about all of them. I'll just tell you, I guess, the one that I remember the most, which is I was constantly saying to myself, oh, he's a great friend, and so what if this happens, you know? That's not everything. I can live with that. I've got the stability of a house and a good partner, and I want for nothing. And then we were at a lunch and he had drank too much and he was driving, and I wouldn't get in the car with him. I was trying to get him to get a taxi, but he wouldn't take the taxi, and he got really angry with me and he slammed off on the car. And I stayed on. I would not get into that car, and I walked home. And when I got home, dusk was setting, and I had no keys. I was trying to rouse him, and I was ringing the doorbell, ringing his phone. He wasn't picking up. I was knocking on the window, just couldn't rouse him. So I guess that knocking was going on for a good 10 minutes, and it was getting louder and louder at my end, thinking I really have to wake him up because it's going to get dark soon. I need to get in. And eventually he did wake, but when he came out of the door, he was like a raging bull. He grabbed me by the hair and he pulled me into the porch, and he started kicking me and literally raining blows on me. And then he went for a knife in the kitchen, My face was full of blood because he'd already punched me so much. And I thought he was going to kill me. And I ran for the sitting room and jammed the sofa against it. And he was outside hammering the door saying, look what you made me do. Look what you made me do. I knew it would take a while to put manners on you. Called me every name under the sun. And definitely it was me that made him do it, not him. And I kept saying, you need to leave him. You've got to leave him. My eyes were swollen. I ended up with 3 broken ribs. And I have a muscle on the side of my face that he broke that day. And he broke these bones and these muscles on the left-hand side. So when I smile, it goes down on this side. So even when I'm at my most happiest, it reminds me, when the camera guy says smile, all I can think about is I'm so embarrassed with this lip that goes down instead of up. I woke up about, 3 or 4 a.m. and he was standing over me with that knife. And I thought, this is it, I'm done. And instead of that, he got down on his knees, cried his eyes out, said he'd kill himself if I left him, apologised again and again and again, kept saying, please forgive me, please, give me another chance. This will never happen. I'll go for counselling. I'll do anything you want me to do. And I'd say after that, it took me another 2 years to leave him. I was living in Wimbledon and working in Harrow. It's quite a long drive. So I would go in every Monday morning crying that I hadn't left him. And I would leave every Friday promising that I would leave him. But
did the attacks become more frequent as the years went on? Or
I think that after that huge one, where I was out of work for 3 weeks, 4 weeks, he had to take me to a doctor. The doctor came out and called him out. That was really difficult for me. I mean, that's when people get involved in domestic violence in a really bad way. The doctor had seen me in his surgery, and he obviously didn't believe my story. I told so many lies. I got involved in a bar fight inadvertently. I fell down the stairs, all kinds of things. But I had bruising everywhere and all along my tummy and my waist and my arms and my face. And one of my eyes wouldn't open. And I just looked a mess. So it's very hard to explain why you might look like that. And instead of him saying to me, how can I help? He brought me out to the waiting room and started calling him out in front of everybody. And of course, he went crazy about it. He wouldn't take me back to that doctor. I wasn't able to drive at the time. So it wasn't good. But I did. There was a kernel of, I'm definitely leaving him. But we had all these drama moments where he would throw my clothes out the window. He would say, I'm going to slash my wrists. I'm going to kill myself. You can't leave me. Everything was just too difficult. Then I was thinking, where am I going to live? I have no money in my account. He has all the money. I had all the debt. I literally had nothing. So my mum and dad came over this weekend and we went for something to eat. He must have had a bad moment, a cocktail, a drink, I don't know what. But my dad was at the bar. We went to a bar for a drink and he was behind him and my mum was sitting behind me and I stood up to talk to him and it probably was something like, you need to stop drinking, I'd say. And he just gave me this biggest slap across the face. And it was the audacity of that slap. My dad just feet away from him at the bar and my mother right behind me. It was like, I can do this and you can do
nothing.
F all about it. Yeah. And I was so shocked. I was like, he just did that. And my mum and dad are actually physically in this room with me. My dad came back and said, did you eat something bad? The whole side of your face has gone bright red. My mother knew. Oh, she knew. She stood up. He went wandering out to the car park to get away. She went out after him and I saw her pointing the finger and shouting at him. And she came back and she said, you have to leave him this week or your 2 brothers will spend a lifetime in prison because they'll murder him. I don't know what's going on. You need to talk to me about it, but you need to get out.
And that was the first clue that your parents had that was going on. You'd managed to keep it from them.
I never told anybody, not one person.
Goodness me.
So because of that, I knew I had to leave him. It was great. I just think if we asked women, how did you leave, more than we asked them, why did you stay, we might actually learn something about, those of them that don't have a brilliant Max Casey. Like there might be something that we could do. I got up on the Friday morning and packed a tiny case. I left everything behind. I'd have bashed out Renault or something, red Renault, I think, in the driveway. And I'd rehearsed that speech a million times. So I woke him up and I said, I'm going to leave you, and because of the violence. And I was just into my speech and he's going, would you go back to bed? It's like 5 a.m. in the morning. And I continued with my speech and then I just heard him snoring gently in the background in the middle of my big speech. And I just went down the stairs and got into the car. I remember driving away thinking, I feel like I'm driving off a cliff. I've never felt anything so nerve-wracking in my life. I had my coat on inside out. I had to go into work because you'd never tell your work in those days that you were going through this. I looked up hotels. The Ibis at Heathrow was the cheapest, $39.99. I'll never forget it. And I slept there that night, and I always remember sitting on the floor, bawling my eyes out because my phone was blowing up. Like, his friends were trying to get me to go back. He was threatening all kinds of things. And I could hear these families who were excitedly going off to Disneyland on the trip for a lifetime, between their paper-thin walls, laughing and joking. And I didn't know where I was going to live. I didn't know what was going to happen to me. And I did loads of sofa surfing and stayed on people's couches and, lived like that for a few months. I didn't go back. My biggest fear was, because it was so terrible, not knowing where I was going to live or what was going to happen, that I would go back to him, but I didn't.
I don't really know what to say to that story. It's just, it's unbelievable, isn't it?
The one thing I'd say is, I remember driving away and saying, nobody's ever going to do that to me again. I'm not going to be financially dependent on anyone. I'm going to stand on my own 2 feet. I use that phrase quite a bit. I would never, first of all, I had met Richard, who was the love of my life. I would never have had my lovely son, Dara. I would never, ever have owned businesses. I had no interest in doing anything like that until he did that to me. And I said, I'm going to get to the stage where I will never be reliant on anyone. And in many ways, it defined me a little. It didn't devastate me. I'm still there. I did a TED talk on it. There's only one other woman who's a survivor who's spoken openly, who can speak openly on TED, apart from advocates. And she's almost got the same story as me. I had a great, successful life. I went through this terrible thing, but actually I got out of it and I went on to lead a really successful life. And that's a really important message that I want to give to women in domestic violence, because Allianz actually did a campaign, The World's Strongest Women, and it was such a great change of the narrative. It was a recasting of this idea that these women are weak and they stay with abusive husbands. God, I've never been more courageous than the woman who lives through a sleepless night and gets up and goes into work the next day and holds down a job. And, that's the strongest I've ever been in my life. I didn't have confidence when I left him. That took a lot of years. I mean, I was not a confident person. I don't know how to say this eloquently, but, nursing doesn't inspire questioners and risk takers. It didn't at that time. Yeah. And confidence. And I definitely, if I'd had more confidence, I wouldn't be living in the situation I was living in. So it was very much first and foremost about having the courage and the strength to walk away from it. And then the confidence came.
Yeah. But we hear so much about women that leave, and it takes them, I don't know how many goes or how many attempts at leaving and going back until they finally can really break away. But it can be so very difficult if they're financially dependent, if there's children involved. Like, there's so many reasons why they should stay. Yeah. And how difficult it is. So the work that you do with Women's Aid.
Yeah. The two things that struck me as how I could, after I spoke about it, it was, first of all, the worst thing I've ever had to do in my life. I couldn't speak to anyone for quite a long time afterwards. I was really destroyed by how vulnerable it was to go on national television and talk about something I'd never talked to anybody about. Apart from in the days leading up to the late. Of course, I had to tell my brothers. My mum, my sister knew. Dara has always known. But it was really, really hard to sit in that sofa and tell that story. I was definitely back in those horrible rooms with all of those things happening to me while I was talking about it. You can tell I'm upset now. Yeah. It's not something that I can talk about that easily, but I think every time I talk about it, somebody out there reaches out afterwards and says, you helped me, I'd say 4 days after I was on the late. I love plants and went to Bloom, of course, in the Phoenix Park with a friend of mine. And even then I was trying to hide my face and pretend I wasn't who I was, because I felt terrible walking around in broad daylight, having sat on the sofa and said that to the world. And I was buying a plant, and the man who was serving me gave me my change, and he grabbed my hand and he was crying. He said, you saved my daughter's life.
Oh,
We've been telling her forever to leave that man. And she watched you on Friday night and she realised, because I actually said those words, why are you talking? I think Ryan asked me, why are you telling her? I said, because out there on the sofa, there's a couple, and she knows and he knows that what I'm talking about is happening in their life. And I hope she has the strength to leave him,
Yeah. That's unreal, isn't it?
the two things that I sort of concentrated on in helping, one was young people. So Women's Aid had a campaign which I fundraised for called 2 Into You. And it's really aimed at young women and young men, I'd say between the ages of 16 and 23, when you set out in a relationship and you don't know if it's toxic or not. And you just do a simple questionnaire. It's a brilliant website, 2 Into You. And you can go through it and, at the end, he's checking your phone, if he's demanding to know where you are, and you kind of know you're in a toxic relationship. Because I didn't know that my relationship was toxic, as a young person. I had no experience of what a stable, I remember meeting Richard and thinking, oh, that's love.
Yeah.
That's what love looks like, because I didn't know what it looked like. And I still think there's generations of young people out there who don't know what love looks like. And they get very confused, especially when somebody overwhelms you with words of affection and love.
Love bombing, I think it's called as well, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that was a really good thing to do. And I meet people all the time saying, oh, this young person didn't know it, so did this simple questionnaire, understood it was.
So for anyone out there listening to this podcast, and if they are in a situation where a similar situation or a situation where they don't feel safe, what's the first thing that they should do?
Call Women's Aid.
Okay.
I mean, I think, there's a lot of great people out there who've launched initiatives for women to talk in a safe space. So some employers, for instance, have trained their HR team so that I could never have done that, gone to the HR team and said, can I talk about domestic violence? They've got some have days off and, they can hive off a little bit of the salary into another bank account to give her running away money. But really, Women's Aid, or one of the great refuge places, Women's Aid run the 24-hour national helpline. I'm sure you're going to give it out at the end of the program.
Yes.
But and there's always somebody at the end of the phone. So and the biggest thing I often get if I'm speaking about it is a woman will come over and say, he's never hit me. It's coercive control. There's a reason why the law changed around coercive control, because it's just as important that those women and men on occasion get help. Because in many ways, the physical injuries with me, they faded. I know some of them still stay in my mind, and there was a bit of PTSD about reliving some of the moments. But the coercive control bit is really psychologically far more damaging, I think, to me. So I always say to women, do not think in any circumstances that nobody is judgmental. Anybody who's picking up the phone at Women's Aid is there to help you.
Okay.
And whatever your needs are, whether it's, issues around going to the Gardaí or issues around being in a safe place for the night, they're the first port of call always. I help women, a small group, anonymously, confidentially, but they often have complex cases that have been drifting on for years. That in this country, we're great at the emergency. Like, we need to get somebody into a safe place with her children, or even somebody without their children. And we do need more refuge places, but, we're pretty good at that, the emergency line and staffing up. Unfortunately for women, that's often the first step on a very, very long road, especially if they have children and there's custody battles and there's divorce and there might be criminal proceedings pending. So that's just is a huge mess eventually for women. They're 4 or 5 years, they can't get divorced, they're not getting any alimony, they're not getting any money, they're threatened to be kicked out of their apartment while he's living in the family homes, all kinds of complications.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Norah, obviously the reason why, as well as all of the television programs that you've done and all of those interesting things that are on your CV, you are a woman in business, and you very much are at the forefront of people's minds as someone in Ireland that stands out there, that's done a lot in business. And as a female, I suppose it's great. So I'm wondering what advice you'd have for women that are either starting out in business, that want to go the route that you've done, that want to do that jumping ship. Do you have any advice for them on how to navigate that road?
First of all, rather than doing the very long version, I have these 10 steps to success, which over the course of my corporate life, running businesses and then being a female founder and entrepreneur and investor myself, I just know that if you're starting a business out there, just read those 10 steps. They're up on LinkedIn. I've also done a training program with Jen Connect You. So if you don't go through those processes, I don't think you'll ever make it beyond the starting line. There's so many people who start and they don't get there at the other side. The most important thing about young people growing up, I would say, is set out to make a difference. If I go into schools, often kids get their hands and they want to be, I want to make millions. I say, okay, you'll never make millions. If you start off wanting to do the thing you love and you want to make a difference, if you make millions, that's the bonus. So in reality, I think that I'm seeing more and more young people talking to me about social enterprise, which is lovely to see, where they're trying to do good for society. And I think these new generations that are coming through, they want to have something that feels more like a mission. They want to feel that they are doing something which is good for society. And if it also happens to have commercial value, then that's good, like Foodclad, I mean, there's some brilliant examples out there of young people doing that work. The second thing I'd say is you have to be bloody good at the one thing you decide to do. Like we're just doing the Leaving Cert now, and I say all the time, you will never again in your life be asked to regurgitate at speed something you've learned by rote. I hardly remember anything I learned in school. I mean, maybe I have geography a bit, but most of that goes out of your head. So if you want to be a violin player, be a bloody good violin player. Do the Malcolm Gladwell 10,000 hours and be the best you can be at that. You don't have to be the best at French and geography and history and Latin, but if that's what you're doing, you need to be the best. If you're going to make jewellery, be the best jeweler. If you're going to be a pharmacist, be the best pharmacist. Be the craziest. Be the standout pharmacist of Ireland. But everyone says to young people that mediocrity is okay, and it just isn't. I'm not a great believer in that we should live our lives by exams. I disagree with that totally. But I think if you're going out there to be a chartered accountant and you're just middling at it, then that's not a good message to send to young people. If you want to succeed in life, whatever path you choose, and I've chosen multiple paths, you just have to be good at it. You can't just embrace half of it and say, I'll just muddle on and get by,
Yeah.
The reality is you have to be great at it. And I guess the last one I would say is be authentic, because I grew up in business when I had to wear a black suit most of my business life. Margaret Thatcher was setting the tone of be more man than the men. And in reality, I was the only woman around most of those tables. You wouldn't draw attention to yourself. If I talked about my lipstick, I think they all saw my IQ dipping before their eyes. So you couldn't be feminine and glamorous and intelligent all at the same time. So, be authentic to yourself. I wear what I want now. Obviously, when I started owning my own business, it gave me the opportunity to just express myself the way I want to express myself. I grew up in boardrooms and corporate life where they said, leave your feelings at the door and your family. Like you were almost told to divide your life in two.
Yeah.
I hate the phrase work-life balance, as though your life begins after 5:30 and work begins at 9. And, it just, for me, work and life is seamless.
A big mess. One big kind of messy
big
life,
mushy mess. And I love it. Because if you spend most of your life doing something, you better love it. And I know that not a lot of people get the opportunities that I've got to do something that I really love to do. But I would definitely say I've done Malcolm Gladwell's 10,000 hours definitely in strategic work with companies and mentoring women. I sit on the board of Vital Voices, which was set up by Hillary Clinton and Madeleine Albright, the late Madeleine Albright. I'm on the European board, but I'm a global ambassador for them for mentorship. So for the last 4 or 5 years, I mentor women all over the world. And they're not women who are in startups. They're women in serious economic empowerment. There's a wonderful woman in Delhi, Shilpi, she's listening in. She has An Hotel, which is a very cool way of experiencing India without going to the big chain hotels. You go to stay in homesteads up in the mountains or in Varanasi. A wonderful woman, Ida Bakri, she's in Brussels. I'm just back from being with her. She just got her B Corp. So for me, helping women by mentoring them through all the difficulties that they go through in business is just my inner strength. I end the week thinking, I love the fact that I've done that. And in Ireland, sometimes we don't have a full appreciation of how great it is here. That's not to say that there aren't things that should be fixed, but even during COVID, like I'm talking to Shilpi in India, there was no COVID supports. Her staff had relatives that were dying. She had relatives that were dying. There were people queuing in the street who were literally dying trying to get into hospitals. And I was also mentoring women here and helping them to get strategic banking funds and loans. So as a country, we were doing phenomenally well during COVID. And I don't often say that enough, because if you're mentoring people right across the world, you understand a little bit more about how special it is to be in a country like this.
Yeah. What's the standout moment in business for you? So what's the best thing that you feel has happened or that you've done, and the worst?
But firstly, I would say the standout moment for me was probably buying the business in 2004. And I remember walking over Leeson Street Bridge, and look, if I had wings, I would have flown. I was so proud of myself.
Yeah.
I had been through the MBO twice, and then finally we got it over the line. was like having a baby. I didn't believe it until I actually signed it and could see it, you know. And like having a baby, I didn't even decide on a name till the night before. So I was like, oh, I'll just call it Magazine Company, and then realised, you know, I've never wanted my own name in a business, that they were all taken. And we had a website called Venus. And I saw in some literature thing that she had a daughter called Harmonia, and even better, she was connected to Cadmus, the god of the press or something. I'll call it Harmonia. And then all the wags around town were calling it Hormonia. Now, I don't mean WH, hormones, Hormonia. And all my checks started coming to Harmonica. My cash flow was up the creek for the first 6 months. I couldn't send them back. So it's not Harmonica, it's Harmonia. Give them a lesson in, you know, the Greek mythology. So that was a really big moment in my life, as in, like, oh my God, like I came from Stanhope Street and went out in the world and did all these things, and these things happened to me, and look at me, I own all the magazines in Ireland. Not all, but nearly all. I was delighted. It was just the biggest high. Of course, we slogged our guts out for the first 2 years, didn't take a holiday, remortgaged the house twice. You know, it was the typical, you know, I thought I could do everything, and realised that, you know, it's just a lot of hard work. I mean, of course, afterwards people say, you're so lucky that you did that. And luck has nothing to do with it. It's just the harder I work, the luckier I get. But it was phenomenal. And then I would say the other thing that was great was selling them, which is a terrible thing to say, because I clung on to the business after Richard died, probably way beyond. I was an absentee landlady for quite a long time. I lost all the energy to, you know, I had investments, and, you know, most people who want investments, they want your expertise as well. I didn't have enough energy to get out of bed myself, let alone give anyone else energy. So I should have made that decision sooner. I remember selling the guts of the company. I still have Woman's Way, and I have a new travel women's magazine coming out. And of course, I spend my life doing film, and I have a production company. So I was sitting on the floor in my house when Richard died. There was a million photos of him in the kitchen. And my mother's very wise. She said, you might not want to. I would sit and have coffee with him every morning. She said, you might want to move that to the hallway so that when you feel you need to see Richard, you look at him rather than being so pervasive everywhere in the house. So eventually I had the courage to take all of these down and put his beautiful portrait in the hall. So I sit on the floor in the hallway when I want to have a chat with him. And it was the night we sold the business, and I got a bottle of champagne and poured a glass and sat on the floor and had a big old chat about, I should have done this, you know, ages ago, but I've done it now. And I felt a sense of, not sorrow, really. It was more relief, that's the honest truth. As in, I think that chapter should have ended probably a lot sooner for me. And the next day I was doing Dancing with the Stars. So it was like the weirdest time of my life. Like, it was just this strange...
Such a slip, isn't it?
Yeah, it was just the strangest. Like, you know, my brother was going, what? Like, I need you to sign all these. I said, no, I'm going off now training with Curtis Pritchard for 12 hours a day.
Fair play to you. And what was the worst thing, or in business, is there any kind of moment that you're like, oh gosh, it was awful, it was an awful experience? Or...
We certainly had a few terrible, stupid business things that happened. You know, there was an issue of Woman's Way where somebody had written an article about making baby food or something, and they got the measurements wrong. And I think it was like 3 teaspoons of salt instead of sugar. I can't remember exactly.
Okay.
But we had to trash the whole lot. I think they tried first redacting and then there was like 60,000 copies of it. Then we sort of trash and reprint it. And then another time we did a safe sex issue for You magazine, and at the time everyone was doing cover mounts. So cover mounts were basically where you give a free lipstick. So you couldn't sell a magazine unless you had a cover mount. Some of the cover mounts are so big the magazine was stuck to the cover mount, you know. Free handbag, free lipstick, free this, free that. And we gave away a free condom on the cover, but unfortunately they stapled it to the cover.
No way.
Yeah. So I had a lot of babies called Norah Casey. Anyway, we had to trash that as well.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. And I think it was the same one. Oh my God, can I admit this?
Yes, do please.
Okay, so we were transitioning. When I came in first, there was no sex in any of the magazines. I just don't understand why. Like, I mean, Cosmo and everything were all full of sex, but Woman's Way, Tatler and You were the 3 main women's titles. And there used to be a joke about, you know, You magazine teaches you how to have an orgasm, Irish Actual teaches you how to fake an orgasm, and Woman's Way teaches you how to knit an orgasm. So I said, look, got the 3 editors, and we need to have sex everywhere. You stop denying women sex, natural, healthy thing that women do in their lives. So you all have to have sex content. Well, the one team that embraced it fully was You, because it's a young magazine. So we were owned by Smurfits at the time. Smurfits owned that company. I bought my companies from Smurfits. Great company, by the way. I was the only woman CEO, but they were fantastic to work with. And one day they had, on the cover, there was a whole pile of them, but there was something called Mickey Mania, was a big cover line, right? And I remember my CEO coming in and just throwing it down in front of me and saying, please tell me that's a boys' band. And I said, unfortunately not. But the following week, they had this cover line. It said, anal sex, can you be arsed?
Oh.
Question mark. Well, firstly...
Was that...
on the cover.
Oh my goodness.
So firstly, a whole pile of newsagents in the West of Ireland refused to put it on their shelves. It was the same safe sex issue, actually, I think, because we'd redone it with it. And then Northern Ireland, there's quite a conservative group of, I won't say their name, in Northern Ireland, they wouldn't they sent the copies back and said, we're not putting that on the shelf. And then there was a Joe Duffy phone in about it, which I got heavily involved in. And, he was saying, well, it's, people are complaining about this. And I said, honestly, we have magazines like Nuts, Loaded and Zoo aimed at young men with pornographic images inside. And we're okay with that. They can exist on the same shelf that me with my safe sex issue is not allowed to be on.
Yeah.
And he was going, okay, fair point. And I said, I walk into any newsagent and you'll see nothing but, they were just basically Penthouse masquerading as boys' magazines.
Yeah.
They were littered all over the place. It was the era of the lads' Bible, the lads' mag,
Yeah.
And then my safe sex issue, fine, they were controversial with their cover lines, but you're supposed to be, I think.
Yeah.
And suddenly a few newsagents decided they would take it and, because they're all getting a bit of a hammering online.
Oh, that's great. That's a great story. That's going into the reel now, okay? I'm just going to let you know that.
Jesus Christ.
So we're going to wrap up. So Norah, you've already answered the advice that you give young people today. So the only question I have for you now is, what is the meaning of life?
Not the first person to ask me that question, by the way.
Okay.
I was one of the early armchair sitters in Gay Burns, The Meaning of Life.
Okay.
So yeah, very difficult, I think, that interview. But I think that after Richard died, I certainly felt that it was like driving along on a road with somebody right next to you and then suddenly a big boulder comes down and, I just didn't even know how to start the car. I had no interest in thinking of the future. When he was dying, you stay in the present. It's an incredible force of will that says you're never to mention Christmas or birthdays or holidays or Dara becoming a certain age or anything that might happen in the future because the person that you love the most in the world is in front of you and will not be here. So your mind gets so used to talking about coffee and tea and the weather and whether the chair is comfortable. So you're forcing, and then when that person dies, his absence was as much the absence of my own future, as in Richard was gone, but my future was over bottles of wine on New Year's Eve, bound up with him. We were going to this together like normal couples do, this is where we're going to enjoy the fruits of our labour and everything. So I saw absolutely no future for me other than that busyness that I described to you. And when I came out of it, I spent a long time, I'm a total geek. You must know that by now. I'm an academic, I'm a geek. I do research on everything before I do anything. Of course, I read every piece of research on grief and had to deal with it. And I eventually did a TED talk on the cure for grief. And the answer is motion, which is shorthand, I guess, for what I discovered about myself, which is, as human beings, we're given foresight and hindsight for a reason. Very important reason is that we reflect on things that happen to us. We don't sit dwelling in the past. We take it and we put it into our subconscious and we use it in order to move forward. And with foresight, constantly searching the future for all the possibilities that it might hold. So I definitely chose life. The moral value I used was there are lots of Richards out there in hospices all over Ireland who won't get to live their life to the full. There are lots of children that won't get to live their life to the full. There's lots of women in Sierra Leone right now who are not worried about whether their son is doing his master's. They're worried about clean water and food. So I definitely made a conscious decision to choose life. And if you choose life, it spawns 100 other decisions. You choose relationships, you choose learning, you choose movement, you choose loving, failing, success. You choose everything that being a vital human being brings you. You embrace it, you drive it, you seize it, you take hold of it, and you just try to live your life in the best way possible. in honor of those that don't get to do it for us. And so many people in my life as they age forget that that's what they should be doing. They don't live vitally. In fact, what they do is they kind of live in the past, or they're in stasis, they're dawdling. They're not living with their eyes wide open. You know, I hear them, you know, they'll say, where are you going on holiday? Oh, I'm going to that place in Spain we always go. So you know where you're going just before you go. And when you land, you know exactly what you're doing. Like, your brain hates that. You know, you say, oh, Thursday night, I always go to the Indian. Yeah, I never go anywhere else. No. And Sundays, roast beef. Would you ever have chicken? Oh, God, no, we've always had roast beef on a Sunday. That kind of sameness and roteness that happens to people as they enter their 30s and 40s. Before they know it, they're saying, why the hell did I get to 40? I remember my brother getting to 50 and he did a speech. And they said, everyone keeps saying, how'd you get to 50? I said, I just woke up and I was 50. So if people are subconsciously going through their life, not living it fully, that's okay. But I'm always here to remind them that you have a choice. We've got the highest life expectancy nearly in the world after Japan. There's a load of life still to live. If you're suddenly giving up at 40 and you're doing things by rote, and worse, listening to music you used to like in the past, you know, wearing the same clothes and the same style and the same hair and the same mannerisms, your circle of friends get smaller. My mother would say, don't sit with him, he'd have a row with himself. You're supposed to have rows. My boy and his friends row and spark and debate, and they're out there making new relationships and taking big decisions and career choices and looking to the future, saying, when I grow up, what do we do when we get to 34? We certainly don't say, I'd like to grow old and vulnerable like my granny. Yeah. We actually start looking backwards. We don't want to think of the future. We don't want to think that we're going to get to 40 or 50 or that we might age. We always look at the entire beauty industry is based on the fact that we do that we want to look younger, that younger is better. We want to constantly look backwards. So for me, my life is always going to be about motion. That was the name of the talk. The cure for grief is motion. Set a sat-nav. Your brain likes sat-navs. We were given that ability for a reason. We're the only species on earth that have it. You know, even if it's only in 4 weeks I'll go to a spa. Or if it's as big as I'm going to do my PhD or climb Kilimanjaro, you have to have a sat-nav. You cannot go up every single day, waking up, going into work, coming home, doing the bath with the kids, making the dinner, going to bed, bottle of wine, Netflix at the weekend, same place, same studies, same work, same colleagues. Your brain hates it.
My goodness, Norah.
That's a very short answer, wasn't it?
That was a really short answer.
Yeah.
It's been an absolute pleasure. I could talk to you for hours, but we might do it again when we're under less time pressure. It was a pleasure to have you. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.